Let's solve mini quiz 6.3b. And we'll start with the first question, which says, describe the transformations necessary to transform the graph of f of x into g of x. Okay. And I'm going to do this question wrong the first time because a lot of people made the same mistake. And I want to explore where some of these misconceptions came from because it's a really, really common, easy to make mistake, and no one should feel bad that they made it. But let's try it out, okay? So here it is. F of x is x cubed, and g of x is 2x cubed. And you might look at this and be like, well, I don't really need to know what to do. But Miss C's first piece of advice was just to graph them and see what's up. So let's try it on the calculator over here. I've already got them plugged in. So there's y equals x cubed and y equals 2x cubed. So the top one will be in blue, the bottom one will be in red. Let's take a look what the graph looks like. Okay, so it looks like the red one is just the blue one, but like squished inwards, right? So it kind of looks like the answer ought to be a horizontal compression. And a lot of people put this in, right? But by what factor? Well, people said, oh, there's a 2, right? And they remembered that, oh, right, if it's horizontal, it does the opposite of what I would expect. So instead of multiplying all the x values by 2, it compresses them. Everything makes sense. I think it's going to be a compression by factor 2. Okay, so a lot of people thought this one, but this is wrong. Okay, it's okay to be wrong, but this one is wrong, and we'll see why. Why? Let's use Desmos instead of the calculator to see what's going on here. So here's the same two graphs on Desmos in exactly the same colors, right? And what you should notice, okay, is that the 0.28 is on the original graph. And if it was being compressed horizontally by a factor of 2, well, then this x coordinate should be divided by 2 and go to 1 comma 8, right? Here's 1, 8. But hang on, this purple dot is not on the red graph. It's not on the transformed graph, okay? That's because this purple dot, or sorry, this blue graph is not being compressed inwards by a factor of 2. It's actually being stretched vertically by a factor of 2, okay? So even though 1, 8 is not on this graph, 216 is, because that point did not go in left, it actually went up. So how does this make sense? How can I tell, like, how do I tell whether it's an inward compression or an upward stretch? Let's take a look back at our original question. Okay. If I erase all of this and take a look at the question again, right? Let's take this top equation and write it like this. F of x equals, where there it is, x cubed. And let's put parentheses around just the x, not the 3, just the x. Now, in order to go from here to the next line, do I multiply inside or outside by 2? Right? What I'm saying is this the same thing as 2x all squared or 2 times x squared? Which of these two matches g of x? It's the one on the right. This one matches g of x. 2x all squared, this one here, would be an inward compression of factor 2. Let's take a look, okay? Let's hide these points. And instead of 2x squared, or sorry, 2x cubed, let's put parentheses around the 2. And now we can see that our graph, now we can see that we have compressed inwards by factor 2. That's because the 2 is inside the parentheses. But in our original question, if there's no parentheses, there are no parentheses. And so when we have to like add them in to figure out which one we're dealing with, we need to put the parentheses around only the x. Only the x. And then the 2 comes in. and then the 2 applies. Okay? So g of x is just 2 times x cubed. And now the 2 we see is outside. It's affecting the output. And so this is a vertical expansion or stretch by factor 2. Okay? Let's go to the next question. Okay? Because I think now it should start to make sense. Okay? So we've got f of x equals x squared and g of x equals 1/2 times x squared. Okay, well, let's try it on our calculator again. Clear that, clear this. Let's go x squared, that's our original, and 1/2. Okay, so if your calculator can't make a fraction, you're just gonna have to use parentheses. X, see, squared, and now let's graph it, okay? Aha, so it looks like it's been stretched outwards. But hang on, if we think about it, that 2 is on the outside of the parentheses, and this 1/2 is on the outside of the parentheses as well. Okay, so it's not, just by the same logic, it's not being stretched outwards, rather it's being squished downwards, it's being squished up and down. Okay, and we can see this on our graph as well. If I replace this with x squared, and I replace this 1/2 x squared, okay? Again, it looks like it's being stretched outwards by a factor of 2, but no, hang on. If it was to be stretched outward by a factor of 2, then the 0.24, for example, would get stretched outwards by a factor of 2 to 4,4. But is 4,4 on the transformed graph? No, it's not. Okay, because what's being done is not that this point is being stretched outwards, it's being compressed downwards. Actually, what's the point should be 2, 2. There it is. So this point here has been shifted, or not shifted, but rather squished downwards vertically, which is why this is a vertical compression of factor 1/2. Okay, let's try this next question, right? We have f of x equals x cubed, and I want to transform the given function as described and write the resulting function as an equation. My original is x cubed, right? And I want to compress it horizontally by a factor of 1/2. There's a typo here on some versions of the quiz, right? Let's start by writing the same equation, and let's put parentheses around just the x again, around just the x. And now if I want to compress horizontally, this will affect the input, right? So I think most of you did understand that you wanted to stay inside the parentheses if you want to change the input. But the question is, do I multiply or do I divide by 2? Should this be a 2 or should this be a 1/2, right? Well, because I'm on the inside of my parentheses, I want to do the opposite of what I would think. So I would imagine that multiplying x by 2 would stretch out my graph. Okay? But it doesn't. Multiplying by 2, in fact, compresses it horizontally like we want. Let's just check this really quickly, right? So here we have our original function in blue. And if I multiply on the inside by 2, I get a horizontal compression of factor 2. See that? Okay. Another way I could write this is I could just use my f of x notation and say y equals f of, and put the 2 inside the parentheses there. So either of these two will work. Let's try this next one over here. I think we're starting to get it here. Here I want to expand horizontally by a factor of 2. Okay, so again, if I rewrite my equation with an x on its own inside the parentheses, I can understand now that I need to change something inside the parentheses. And if I want to expand by a factor of 2, instead of multiplying by 2, I'm going to divide by 2, which is the same thing as multiplying by a half, right? Like this, okay? I could even continue using my function notation and taking advantage of the fact that f of x equals x cubed. You could just say 1/2 x inside the f there. All 4 of these answers are correct. Okay. Technically, if I was being really a pain about it, if you wrote this, if you wrote something like f of x equals 1/2 x cubed, if you did this, technically this would be wrong because we already have an expression for f of x. F of x is already this thing, okay? But if that's what you wrote, I still counted it, okay? What wouldn't be right, what would be wrong, though, I'll even draw it in another color, would be this, okay? Because this does not have any parentheses. So this would end up being a vertical squish by factor a half, because I could draw parentheses like this without changing the expression. Okay. Finally, we have an equation for a green dotted function, or we want to find the equation of this green dotted function, but our original is here. And by the way, it's already written down for you. On the left, it's f of x equals square root x, okay? We can see that it's being flipped horizontally. Which means I need to be on the inside of my parentheses. And since this is a square root symbol, I don't actually need to write the parentheses. I just need to make sure that the negative is on the inside of the square root. I could also take advantage of my function notation and use this instead. Okay. For the last question, this is a vertical reflection. And so now I want to put my negative on the outside of my parentheses. Right? So my original function, f of x equals x squared. Let's put parentheses around just the x without changing anything. And now I realize, oh, I need to put my negative on the outside of the parentheses. So this is fine. Okay. This is also fine. This is also fine. Whoops. Those are all fine. However, this would not be. because now I've put my negative on the inside. That would create a horizontal reflection. Okay. And this is not being reflected horizontally, being reflected vertically.